Okay. I'm Liz Farrell, Artistic Director of Painting, Drawing, and Printmaking, and our Artist in Residence program. Welcome to our Visiting Critic lecture. I want to welcome our virtual participants watching tonight as well. Tonight we'll be hearing from curator Jasmine Wahi, who is returning to the ranch to visit with our Artist in Residence this week. Jasmine is teaching an exciting workshop at the ranch this summer. It's a masterclass called Career Momentum, Professional Practices for Artists. Before we begin, please silence your cell phones. And for our land acknowledgement, Anderson Ranch acknowledges that our campus resides on the traditional ancestral territory of the Ute people, who've called the Roaring Fork Valley and beyond home for over 800 years. Through our mission to promote a wide range of arts, cultures, and voices, we commit to partner with and honor the indigenous ancestors and residents of this sacred land where we learn, work, and create. Jasmine Wahi is the founder and co-director of Project for Empty Space, a nonprofit organization in New York City and Newark, New Jersey. Her multifaceted curatorial practice predominantly focuses on issues of femme empowerment, complicating binary structures within social discourses, and exploring multi-positional cultural identities through the lens of intersectional feminism. In 2023, Jasmine was honored by the Metropolitan Museum of Art for exemplary social impact work. In 2020, PES, Jasmine became the inaugural Holly Block Social Justice Curator at the Bronx Museum of the Arts, while simultaneously co-directing Project for Empty Space. So let's join me in welcoming Jasmine Wahi.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you to Anderson Ranch for having me back. I love coming here, and one day I will actually make something, hopefully. When I asked Liz what I should talk about today, because some of you know I can talk a lot about a lot of things, and often those things aren't incredibly relevant to the people who are listening. So I said, what should I talk about? And she said, think about what might be relevant to the artist, but also about your practice. And so I thought I would talk about two fairly specific instances in my practice in the hopes that this can sort of cultivate a conversation down the road, whether it's with me or amongst yourselves, about what the art world is and what exhibition spaces are, and how we as cultural practitioners, whether we're curators or gallerists or art lovers or collectors or artists, navigate through these various spaces and understand that there are a multitude of opportunities that exist within the art ecosystem that are there for artists, and it's a matter of perspective and, I think, goal orientation to think about how you would like to fit into this art world infrastructure. And so the two examples from my practice that I have decided to share with you is from my time as a museum curator, which was when I was at the Bronx Museum. And also, truth be told, I can't remember if this show was in 2021 or 2022, but I guess time doesn't exist in the COVID period, so it was one of those years. And the other project is one that I am still currently working on called Body Freedom for Everybody. And I guess I decided to only speak about these two projects and not necessarily about my teaching practice or my writing practice, which are very intertwined with my curatorial ideas, because I want to leave plenty of room for questions, because I think artists often don't have a lot of opportunity to ask curators or people with auction house experience or commercial gallery experience questions that may not get a straightforward answer. So I give you the preface that when we open it up for a Q&A, you may ask me absolutely anything you want, and if I don't feel comfortable answering it or don't have an answer, I will simply tell you. But beyond that, the world is your oyster for this brief period. So as I as you heard in my bio, I do quite a few things. My organization project for Empty Space has 7 core programs with a full-time staff of 5. So we are sort of constantly working. I think it's an important thing for people who are makers or integral to the sort of creative aspect or generative aspect of the art world to understand that being in art is not a job or even a career, it's a lifestyle. And so I spend most of my waking hours and sleeping hours actually thinking about art, thinking about artists, thinking about the ways in which we can create equity for artists in all different senses and create spaces for artists to have opportunity to move forward in their careers in a world that is becoming ever more expensive, ever more censored, and I think ever more stringent around artists who are trying to make practice. And so I have vacillated between various aspects of the art world. We have these 7 programs: public art, artist grants, exhibitions, artist in residence. I do a lot of external curatorial projects as well, because I think I am a glutton for punishment, but also it helps keep me limber, in a sense, in thinking about what the larger ecosystem of the art world is, and also how this ecosystem fits in with a larger societal discourse and a broader ability to make social change and social impact. So I'm one of those perhaps naive people that believes very deeply in my heart that art can actually make systemic and fundamental social change, whether or not broader communities or societies realize that. Sometimes art does it in subversive ways, but the best types of art make social change. So most of my practice, regardless of the format or institution or space that it's in, is rooted in this space, the sort of interstitial space where artistic practice and often formal artistic practice converges with conversations that are important to what's happening in our particular social moment. So the first show that I'll talk about of the 2 is this exhibition, Born in Flames, that I did when I was at the Bronx Museum. I was the first, and I think to this date, only Holly Block social justice curator. I was brought on in 2019, and then COVID happened, and there was a great reckoning within the museum and sort of wider art institutional space about what to do, because we are an industry that relies on face-to-face interaction with work, and our work is heavily reliant on experience of that work. And so there were a lot of questions about, do we pivot to online only? Do we mount exhibitions and then film them and then show just images? Do we let people in 1 person every hour? These were, in the beginning, very strange. I mean, we all lived through it. I don't have to tell you what the environments were like. Although I will say in New York, it was particularly difficult, and working in the Bronx specifically was also very difficult because it is a borough that is often very under-resourced. And similar to where I work in Newark, New Jersey, is often overlooked from a resources, an output of resources perspective. And so there was a lot for me to contend with thinking about what it meant to be a social justice curator in a time where it felt like society was frankly falling apart around us. And I guess I should note that a few years after having this position, I do actually take issue with the term or the role of a social justice curator, not because of what the role implies or what the title implies, but because of the excuse it gives to other institutional professionals to not put in the work for social justice initiatives, however you interpret social justice. It's a very broad lens. That's just an aside. So when I was trying to figure out what this title meant to me within the context of this drastically shifting world, a world that shifted really overnight, we had instances sort of systemic racial violence that seemed to come to, for whatever reason, in that particular moment, came to a crescendo. And we saw another sort of tipping point happen socially within this country, and I would argue more broadly as well. And so again, I found myself contending with really what a social justice curator meant in that particular time and space. Although I have been doing this type of work that is thinking about social equity and social discourse for 15 years, since I was like 3 years old. And thank you for whoever laughed. That was a terrible joke. When it wasn't, when it was actually more of a liability than an asset to be talking about some of these things. But of course, everything is constantly evolving and changing, as we know from Parable of the Sower. For those of you who have read it, the only constant is change. And so as a cultural worker, thinking about what social justice meant in 2020, 2021, 2022, I had to think about what that role meant, what the weight of that role meant, and the responsibility I had to address what was happening in a very particular moment. Although what I came to realize with this exhibition, Born in Flames, was that what felt like a crescendo broadly was actually sort of part of a cyclical pattern of history within this country specifically. But sort of before I get to that part, what I decided ultimately was the sort of crux of my role, sort of the thesis behind the work that I did while I was there, was that when we think about social justice work, the first barrier to entry is often a lack of visibility around the problems that produce inequities or systemic oppressions. And if you don't see something, you can't work reparatively. And so I decided that my thesis would be that visibility is the primary tenet of social justice work. That is something, again, in sort of evolution of time that I have since slightly revised, because I think there is much more to the term visibility than optical visibility. But that's a different conversation. If anyone has questions about that, I'm happy to expand on it. So for this show, I mentioned that I realized that a lot of these issues, and this was not my first realization, but a lot of the issues that we were facing then and continue to face today are part of a cyclical and systemic pattern of social behavior. And in this case, I was trying to think about what sort of group show I wanted to do. I knew I wanted it to have a feminist arc, but I also knew I wanted it to have a feminist arc that was somewhat hopeful. So I decided I wanted to do a futurism show, which, like, in the past 15 years, what curator hasn't done a futures show? So, take that with a grain of salt. But I decided that what the differentiator would be was that this would be a futurist show through the lens of intersectional feminism, and it would be a show rooted in hope and utopia and visions of a sort of better future. And then a friend of mine at the Smithsonian played the film Born in Flames, which, has anyone here seen Born in Flames? Okay, one person. I highly recommend it. It is a film that was made in 1972, I think, and was made as docufiction, basically. So the premise of the story is that the protagonist is a young Black woman who is working in a union in a future utopian city that is a socialist city. And it becomes very apparent very quickly in the beginning of the film that this socialist society isn't actually that much better than a capitalist society. It's just sort of a wolf in sheep's clothing. And this protagonist is part of a collective of union workers who are also all women, and they get fired one day. And without giving too much of the story away, what sort of comes to pass is the protagonist is shot and killed in an instance, in an act of fatal police violence. And so I watched this film, and it was by complete coincidence that it was playing around this time, and I realized how little had changed since this film had been made, and how this film almost served as a foreshadowing, a forewarning of what was to come. And it was a damning reality that we had not been able to resolve any of these problems in that time. So then, very rapidly, my show went from being about utopian futures to interpret the future however you'd like to for the artists who were participating. And so I invited 13 artists, including Lizzie Borden, who made Born in Flames, to participate in the exhibition. And one of the reasons I'm sharing this show with you is because I consider this endeavor of making this show to be a collaborative effort. I know every curator is different in how they work. Some have an idea and they like to approach artists about work that they already have and have a very specific vision for that show. Others are building shows with artists. I work sort of in an in-between way. I have my own vision, but I also think that the artist, as the originator of the work that makes up said show, should be sort of the center of how we work around these processes of exhibition making. And so I invited these artists and worked with each of them collaboratively to set up an area within the exhibition space that was kind of their own arena within the space that they could do whatever they wanted to some extent in sort of working as a thought partner with me. And so what ended up happening, sort of the conceptual conceit for this, the layout of this show, was that I was creating a galaxy of futures and potentialities. And a lot of this came from reading science fiction. I found by complete coincidence that every artist in this exhibition was deeply inspired by Octavia Butler's work, so that was a lovely coincidence. And we created together this show about various futures. And I was really intentional about wanting this show to be not only interdisciplinary, but also intergenerational, multiracial, multicultural, and sort of span as much of the sort of breadth of futurist practices as I could. So there are artists who are thinking within the space and spectrum of Afrofuturisms, indigenous futurisms, Asian futurisms, et cetera, et cetera. And they're all looking at them from different vantage points. So here, in the previous image, you had Chitra Ganesh, who had a site-specific installation, which you can kind of see in the background here. We had Saya Wolfak, who made this incredible dashiki mono on this very strange architectural intervention that was a tea that was actually created by Sanford Biggers, which was the show that preceded my show. And we decided to keep it up because Saya came in and said, "Oh, there's my kimono wall." And I was like, "Oh, okay, well, there you go." And they have a friendship and have a connection over a shared history with Japan. So it was kind of this beautiful moment that we worked together on. Huma Baba and then Clarissa Tosin sort of in the background over there. This part of the show I am particularly proud of because Wangechi and I made this site-specific installation during COVID over Zoom while she was in Nairobi and I was in the Bronx. And I think it turned out, pat myself on the back. And obviously I'm biased, but I think it turned out splendidly. This was the entry into the show. And I think it also did something that was important for the show that I hadn't thought of until she introduced this work. And it was playing with the idea of dualities that are non-binary or non-divisive. What this installation is playing with is different understandings that violence and safety can exist in parallel or simultaneously in one space or one body, that fragility and strength can exist in one space and time. So you'll see here, and this is a composition made up of a number of other pieces that Wangechi sort of cannibalized and put into this new installation. So there are these sculptures that have been a long time part of her practice, and the question is, are they stilettos, or are they stripper shoes, or are they weapons? They're obviously made out of some organic material, but contain elements of plastic and metal in some of them. There are these legs. The question is, are the legs sort of severed off of a body? Are they sacrificial? Are they a point to be revered? And then it's a little bit hard to see in this image, but we don't have it there. Is this bronze head resting on a marble pillow in the back. And the question is, again, is this a sacrificial head? Is this an allusion to violence? Is this some sort of goddess character? Is she the protector? All of these are questions that remained unanswered in the show, and I thought it was actually very important to create this space of overarching ambiguity, particularly in the time that we were living in, where there actually were certain things that were very clear, but certain things that were also obfuscated in what was happening around us. And so I thought of this particular sort of shrine area, I guess for lack of a better term, as a place of both solace and frenetic energy. And I thought it was really important to have this as the entry point into the show. For me, is always really important to capitalize on all space that is visible to publics, not just in order to bring people into an institutional space, but also for people to understand that they have a place, even if it's not inside the actual exhibition, they can be in dialogue with the content of what's going on. So my co-director at Project for Empty Space, Rebecca Jample, is also a design professor at Rutgers, and so she collaborated with me to make this exterior installation, vinyl installation that used the portrait, the film poster from the original film Born in Flames, and it became a selfie spot in the middle of the Bronx, and that was kind of exactly what it was supposed to be. I think institutions historically have been thought of as exclusionary spaces, particularly white spaces. And so this intervention was, I think, a way to very visibly combat that idea and you know, in the most sort of almost cliche of ways, saying that there is a space for you and people who look like you in this museum, which again now sort of sounds quaint and cliche, but it is a very real hurdle and barrier to entry that people think that they are not allowed in institutions because they don't think there's anything in there for them. So that was what this aspect of the exhibition was. So now we come to the very, very different type of exhibition, which is the project that I am still working on. I've been working on it now since I guess 2019. It's called Body Freedom for Everybody, and it is a traveling exhibition inside of a box truck that was donated to us that we retrofit to be a white box gallery. But to sort of give you some contextual background information, this exhibition started as what we deemed at the time in 2019 as an emergency exhibition. And it was a collaborative effort between myself and my partner, Rebecca, Marilyn Minter, Lori Simmons, Gina Nani, and Sandy Tate. And we all got together with these sort of various roles in this project to pull together an exhibition that was both conceptually and thematically rooted in conversations around reproductive justice, and also a fundraiser for Planned Parenthood. And that exhibition was called Abortion is Normal, and it started early in 2019 when there was a great deal of legislation proposed, mostly in the South and sort of southwest of the country, against abortion access. And I remember very distinctly Marilyn, who we knew each other from teaching at the same school. She called me and she was like, if any of you knew Marilyn, I'm not going to try and do an impression, but you can picture or hear her saying this. She was like, what the fuck are we going to do? And I was like, I don't know. What are we supposed to do? And she's like, well, we have to do something. And I was like, well, you're an artist and I'm a curator. Why don't we put on a show? And she was like, great idea. Let's do it right now. And I was like, well, it does not really work like that. So we brought in some more partners to sort of think about what this exhibition should be, where it should be. What it ended up being was 3 shows. The first one was sort of a test show in my space in Newark, which at that time was inside a train station. And then we did 2 in Manhattan at Eva Pressenhuber Gallery and Arsenal Contemporary over 6 weeks. And we raised a lot of money, and it was a great show. And in hindsight, well, before I say in hindsight, it was interesting because that show drummed up a lot of attention, a lot of very negative attention. And I think mostly it was because we went with a very contentious title at the time. Abortion is Normal is a bold statement. Although now, in hindsight, it seems very quaint, given how the sort of socio-political landscape has changed in the past 5 years. But we did it. It was something that we always intended to travel. And then, of course, COVID happened. So it didn't really go anywhere until 2024. And when it came time for us to start thinking about doing this again, and, you know, Roe v. Wade was overturned, and we were like, should we do the show? And we said, no, we're going to think about it more, how we want this to be iterative and impactful. And then as time went on in 2022 and 2023, we realized, or I guess we're more acutely aware of sort of movement against queer and trans folks. And we saw that this movement was really happening in parallel in some ways, in intersecting ways with the movement against reproductive access. And so we decided to think about the way in which certain bodies, and identities are allowed to exist in a more expansive way than just being about abortion. And in the first show, there was some of that, but in this iteration, we decided it was really important to lean into 3 kind of tenets for this show, which were reproductive freedom, queer liberation, and trans joy. And so those sort of 3 thematic underpinnings were what built out the framework for this show. And so someone very generously, it was always sort of like this joke pipe dream, oh, we'll do an exhibition in the truck and we'll drive it around the country. And then someone gave us a truck. And so when someone gives you the thing that you're laughing about all the time, you actually have to stop laughing and just do the thing. And so we spent time raising money, reaching out to artists, and retrofitting this truck into a white box gallery space. And within this, and Barbara Kruger very, very generously did the entire exterior of our truck, something I will never be able to repay her for, but it was incredibly generous. In total, we have over 120 artists participating in this project. Last year, we went to 14 cities over the course of 3.5 months, and talked to people about how the artists' visions or responses to these 3 ideas, whichever they chose to respond to, catalyzed these conversations around justice broadly, and bodily autonomy. And that's really what we did. We talked to everyday people all over the place. And what I came to realize, I had sort of 3 realizations. One was that art is genuinely impactful and sometimes is more impactful outside of the traditional spaces where you think art should be. In this case, inside of a truck. And in that way, artists can play an enormous and substantial role in the way that people think about themselves, the way they think about the trajectory of society, in the way they think about policy. Even if they don't agree with what the messaging of the truck is, it's still important for the work to be in dialogue with people and for people to actually have a chance to stop and think about not only their own values, but their sort of interpersonal relationships with the people around them. And so within the truck, we have some participatory projects like this one here by Carolyn Cinders, which invites people to anonymously share their insights or beliefs by picking as many colored explanations as feel resonant to them and then putting them in an envelope. And then as we traveled across the country, we put them up on the wall for display. And then we had Andrea Bauer's interactive ribbon piece, and each ribbon has statements that she has come up with and hand painted on over 800 ribbons in this particular iteration. And then the other wall, I guess I didn't include a better picture of the other wall. The other wall had prints by around 100 artists that rotated at every stop. And so I, again, glutton for punishment, curated about 40-something different shows, because for every stop we went to and every day that the truck was open, we had a different hang. But we thought that was really important because the artists were from all over the country, and we're talking about different issues that were really specific to their own communities and experiences. And so we thought it was essential that a multitude of viewpoints were reflected within the the confines of this exhibition space. And so we did that for a time. It was very exciting. It's probably the most challenging project I have done to date. And it is something that, in spite of it being very challenging, we have decided to continue on this year and into the near and far future, as long as the truck runs, because we think it is as important, if not more important now, to continue to have these conversations within our sort of multitudinous and intersecting communities all over the place. Wherever people will have us, we will go. And that's, I guess, the most recent project that I'm working on. And I have no idea how I am for time, so I guess I'll open it up for questions. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Well-
Jasmine. Or you can talk more. I mean,
Oh, well, I guess I'll just say this,
Yeah, please
this,
share.
this image, I'll explain a little bit about this image. When we had really, really incredible partners, partnering organizations in every city we went to, they really drove the programming behind the truck. And there are too many partners to just sort of list off. They're all on our website, which is bodyfreedomforeverybody.org. And we did programming everywhere. So when we were in Times Square, we decided that we would have a dance party in the middle of Times Square. And so we used Barbara Kruger's work as a backdrop to a pretty massive happening in the middle of Times Square in the middle of Armory Week. And it was, I think, one of the most joyful experiences I've had. And I guess I should note that the purpose of this truck is to spread joy and camaraderie and to be a sort of symbol of self-validation in many ways. And so that is the other reason we are continuing to do it as we continue on. And now I'll open it for questions.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and we are streaming this, so if you can wait till the microphone gets to you so that we can all hear those of you who are watching online as well.
Is that you, Richard?
That's Richard.
With the truck that was traveling around the country, you said you had different partners. How did you raise funding for this project?
By the skin of our teeth. And we're still raising money for this project, I should say, as a shameless plug. Primarily, it was through private funding. We did do a crowdfunding campaign that was very successful. And then some foundation funding, but I'm sure, as you can imagine, foundation funding around this particular topic in an election year was very challenging. So it was a hustle, but we did manage to do it in the end. And yeah, like I said, it's ongoing. As long as we have the funding, we will continue to take the truck where it needs to go.
Thank you.
Jasmine, I have a question. What's sort of a future dream project? I mean, I can see that you think really big, and I'm just wondering, like, an alternative space project that's outside of an institution, like, what's your kind of, what have you always wanted to do, or maybe that's come up through these experiences that's on the horizon but maybe not happening yet?
You know, I always think, what if I just start doing shows about like plein air landscapes? What a nice change that would be. Because truth be told, I love what I do. I love making exhibitions and programs for artists that are around social change and social impact, but it's also emotionally and intellectually and sometimes physically exhausting. But I think something that I would really like to do, there are, I guess, two things. One is to think more about educational structures and sustainability for artists, because if we're thinking about art as an ecosystem, the center of that ecosystem, again, is artists. There would not be an art world or any of it without artists. And so thinking about the ways in which we can fill the gaps from sort of many formal educational institutions that don't teach professional practices and sort of have a program that is accessible and approachable for artists to understand kind of the 101s of the business of art. Because if you want to make a living wage off of your art, you have to understand how these things work, you know, whether it's creating an LLC for yourself or making sure that you have ironclad consignment contracts with a gallery. Those types of things are things that unfortunately, a lot of BFA and MFA programs don't teach for, I have my suspicions on why, but I'm not gonna go into them right now. But they need to, and if they're not doing it, someone needs to fill the gap so that there is an element of sustainability and survivability for artists. And the other thing I think I would like to do genuinely is do a show that is based on aesthetics and not anything else.
That's great.
I think there's one back there.
Jasmine, thanks for being here. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about when we think about like academia or institutions or things like that, and sort of your experience working outside of the box, so to speak, and then like your experience here at the Ranch or places like the Ranch and their role right now, specifically in this political climate.
Yeah. Well, on the first question, how much time do you have? Because I can talk a lot about my experience both in and out of formal institutional structures. Where, I guess, with my experience with starting and running a small to now, I guess, small to mid-size arts nonprofit it is certainly not easy. I don't think I would change anything about where I am today, but it was absolutely a slog getting here. So I would not necessarily recommend going down the same path that I did to get to where I am at this point. Because there is an incredible amount of administrative and logistical work that one has to do in addition to doing the curatorial stuff and the interfacing with artists and the fun stuff. But I say I wouldn't change it because I have an incredible amount of autonomy. And a type of autonomy that I don't think I would be awarded if I was working within a more rigid and traditional academic space. And the point, and I mean, I think there are positives and negatives to everything. In an institutional setting, there are infrastructures in place so that a curator doesn't have to necessarily think about paying the other staff members in the museum or how to raise all the funds for the show. But then, of course, there is a level of oversight and feedback and collaboration that may not exist when you sort of run your own thing. On thinking about sort of the academic or the traditional side, it's something or the formal side of institutional spaces, it is something that I was trained in. I am overly educated and underpaid, and unfortunately, and I try very hard at this point in my career and my curatorial life, because, you know, there's not sort of like an upward ladder of curating. You become a curator and then you're just a curator. I am sort of going through an evolution of thinking about what the academic space actually means and who it actually serves and who our art worlds serve, and even who museums serve and what they mean when they say, like, we are community centric or we want to do community work through our education department. What does that actually mean? And so in thinking about that, I try and create space within my own work to do the opposite of what they're doing, to compensate for the lack of output that is happening. And I think in that same vein, I think places like this, like Anderson Ranch, are really essential in, I think, again, filling really huge gaps for artists as far as having the time and space to experiment. That artists should have more elasticity in their careers than to just be like, okay, I'm done with art school, and now the thing that's going to make me money is this one medium and this one style that I will keep regurgitating for the rest of my career because it makes me money. That also sounds like a slog and not very enjoyable. And so I think it's really important for artists to have room to play, to try new things, to get physical with their work, to expand their skill sets. And I think progressively we're moving towards an art world that is much friendlier and actually much more inclined towards inter and multidisciplinary practices. And it's important for artists to have at least the opportunity to try new media, new discipline, and new ways of making, even if they never actually utilize them in their practice afterwards. It's almost like a way of brain development to have these other skills. So I think this place is like camp. I think it's great. It's like community and summer camp and skill learning all in one. So I think they're very necessary is the short answer.
Hi. This kind of, I think, might piggyback a little bit off of what you were just talking about, but you'd mentioned something about optics when you were talking about the first exhibition, and I was wondering if we could touch on that in a little bit more depth.
Sure. So I have been having quite a few conversations with some artist friends lately about the role and importance of visibility, in particular in the context of this truck exhibition that I'm doing. Because one of the things, and I guess I should back up, I did a TED Talk in 2019 on the topic of visibility to some extent. And one of the things that came up for me in making that talk was thinking about the idea of safety and how visibility can be a point of vulnerability, particularly when it comes to people who have come from historically marginalized communities. Being visible comes with, I think, can come with a level of unsafety. And also in thinking about what visibility means, there is a rationale for making oneself invisible in certain contexts when it comes to safety. And so as I've continued to sort of think about what visibility means, that's one consideration I have, is what does it mean to put yourself out there when the world around you feels and is continuously shrinking against you? And at what point do you have to make the decision to be extraordinarily vulnerable for the sake of progressing culture, and for the sort of long game of protecting your community? So that's sort of one evolutionary thought I've been having about the problematics of visibility. And the other consideration I have is that just being visible, as in visually visible or optically, is actually not enough. And I think it's, in the fight against DEIA, there is an affirmative action. There has been this sort of weaponization of visibility that is just because you come from this community, even though you may not be qualified, now you're going to steal our jobs or whatever the rhetoric is. Without understanding that there's actually substance behind the faces that you see or the bodies that you see, that there is actually a qualification. But if you just see a face in a place without understanding the context or history or background, without doing the due diligence, then you're effectively doing nothing else but sort of satisfying a check mark, a checkbox. And so I think that the phrasing is very catchy, like anything about visibility is catchy, but in order for it to be meaningful, it has to have more substance behind just that idea of being seen.
Yes, you may.
I'm curious how you will sort of navigate that as you move on with your curatorial practice. There we go.
You mean in sort of the context of the world around us?
Yeah, that should go.
Well, I think one of the ways in an exhibition making context specifically, I am more interested now in the ways that we share information within exhibitions, through didactic text, through contextual information, because I think most audiences, particularly those who may not necessarily have committed their entire academic or intellectual exercise in looking at art, actually want information, and that's their point of entry into looking at and engaging with art. And so how do we create those materials that are engaging in a world where attention spans are ever shortening? How do we make it engaging? And also, how do we make it informative without being overly explanatory? So that's one way I'm thinking about moving forward, is giving context to audiences about what it is they're seeing or experiencing. And on the other front, I don't know, I've vacillated over the past however many weeks it's been since January 20th. I've gone through a roller coaster of emotions, and they continue. Today, I suppose, on that little metric of how are you feeling today, my little frame is on defiant, and I think I'm just gonna keep doing what I'm doing, because the reality is, for all of us, whether we're people of color, whether we're queer, whether we're trans, whatever we are, we haven't disappeared. You can try and shrink people, but that doesn't mean they cease to exist. So you just keep on, and if that means leaning into it, then lean into it. And if that means, suffering the consequence of actions, then so be it.
Thank you so much.
Also, I'm here. You can ask me questions still.